Hey everybody, it's Barry and Dave, and we are coming to you with a very exciting announcement, something that is now years in the making, and that is the launch of the Uniquely Human podcast community hosted on Patreon. Barry, tell us a little bit about, the whole reason we're doing this is to expand on our mission of illuminating and celebrating neurodiversity and autism. And we really want to engage as many listeners as possible in meaningful conversation. So can you tell us a little bit more about the mission of this new community that we're launching on Patreon?
Yes, David, it's all about community. And for those of you who have listened to our podcast, we talk about the importance of the strength and the support that comes through community. But it's not just about us and you. It is also about what we can offer to you. And there'll be special perks, such as a new Discord community for members, Q&A sessions with me and with Dave, and of course, brand new Uniquely Human merch. And Patreon members are going to get a little bit of an insider's look and contribute back to us by having meaningful conversations and helping us grow the podcast. And it's our way of expressing gratitude to you all. We have loved having loyal listeners, your contributions, but every bit of support is crucial because it really will enable us to expand the podcast in many ways. So, Dave, what could our listeners do in supporting this new initiative?
Yes. So, once you become a member in this Uniquely Human podcast community hosted on Patreon, we would invite you all to get active and stay active in sharing your thoughts, engaging in discussion, asking questions of the other members in the community. This will really help to shape not only our future content and the direction of the podcast, but it also really helps us, like we said, to expand on the podcast itself and the mission, which is to help to educate and inform and enlighten individuals, families, and professionals on topics related to neurodiversity and autism. This will be a really exciting thing for us.
Great. And so if you wish to join us in this endeavor, you could find the Patreon link on uniquelyhuman.com, our podcast website, or on the notes for each episode where we give additional information and resources for you. Looking forward to taking hands with you and moving forward.
Yes, and thank you all so much for your continued support. We will see you on Patreon. The primary purpose of Uniquely Human, the podcast, is to educate and inform. The views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute educational or medical advice. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with each individual or family for specific guidance.
Uniquely Human, the podcast, is produced by Elevated Studio. Music is graciously provided by Matt Savage of Savage Records.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prezant, clinical scholar, researcher, and consultant on autism and neurodiversity, and a Brooklyn boy raised in the big city.
And I'm Dave. I'm none of those things, and I grew up on a farm in Illinois. But being on the spectrum myself, I have plenty of personal insight to lend.
And this is Uniquely Human, the podcast, a show that illuminates and celebrates autism and neurodiversity.
So, Barry, we have a very exciting new partner in our Uniquely Human community. Do you want to tell us a little more about it?
Yes, we're so pleased to join with our friends at AEP Connections in supporting each other's missions, which are aligned so beautifully.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit more about AEP Connections and what our friends Pilar and Rustin are doing over there.
Well, AEP Connections specialize in neurodiversity education and training. Their mission really is professional development for educators, therapists, staff members, caregivers, and all of those who are supporting children and students from the preschool years through 22. And they really do focus on putting forth professionals doing webinars that are evidence-based with practical strategies about many different topics in neurodiversity. Professionals can also get their continuing education clock hours to meet their professional development requirements. And AEP Connections is accredited by so many different organizations that they could look at online when they go to the AEP website. And the nice thing about AEP Connections is that they're a small company, but they also have hands-on experience in education. So professional development activities are handpicked, and there's awesome customer service, and they just are terrific people to work with.
I'm super stoked to work with Pilar and Rustin there at AEP Connections. So I guess we should mention where people can find them.
Certainly going to aepconnections.com and also checking on the website for Uniquely Human for a link to get to the information on upcoming webinars and presentations.
I love it. And I'll tell you, I am not a professional, as we all know, but I'm going to go get some CEUs just to have some bragging rights when I go to parties with professionals. Anyway, welcome to the Uniquely Human community, AEP Connections. We're super excited to be working with you. It's just going to be a great partnership for all of our listeners. So, all right, Barry, this is a unique episode, a uniquely Barry and Dave episode, because we don't have a guest that's joining us today. This is just you and me.
Oh, it's just the two of us, like a horse and carriage, like...
I'm part of a horse.
Yeah.
I'm the back half. But this will be a really fun conversation because I'll let you explain to the listeners here. But, we were reflecting on our show and, what it takes to produce the podcast and our relationship and how it's grown over the last several years. And it's funny because we are neurodiversity in a nutshell.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting when we think about Uniquely Human, the podcast, focusing on elevating voices that are neurodivergent and really understanding through so many of our guests in our discussions what neurodiversity is. And many of our listeners know that neurodiversity is focused on helping us understand how everybody has a different brain and how differences in brain structure and function may result in people who have different learning styles, different social styles, even different ways to regulate emotionally. But it seems like we always talk about these concepts from a more theoretical or research basis or in the context of our guests, but we never really have discussed these issues relative to Dave and Barry.
Right. And in fact, not on the show anyway, but it's interesting to think on that because when you first reached out to me about, hey, I was thinking about maybe doing a podcast around Uniquely Human and things, and what do you think about that? And I said, awesome, let's do it. And with no planning whatsoever, we just launched in and started a podcast. And it's funny because I think what we've been able to create with this endeavor, I think the strength of the foundation of the podcast is our differences and the ways that we complement each other, but also the ways that surprisingly we almost share a brain sometimes. And I say surprisingly because you're a lot smarter than I am.
Well, wait a second. It's not how smart you are, it's how you are smart. And that is a quote from Howard Gardner, who first spoke about multiple intelligences. So the way you are smart in some ways is far smarter than I am. And the way I am smart in some ways might be smarter than you are in those ways.
Interesting. So my self-deprecating side, which I've been scolded by some listeners not to do that, but my self-deprecating side is that you're smart in the ways that are applicable in the real world. I'm smart in terms of I remember every Jim Carrey line from every Jim Carrey movie, which is not helpful.
But that's very valuable in some worlds, such as a comedy club.
It actually is. It's one way, and this is one very specific, silly example, but it is one way, by the way, that I use that particular, we'll call it an intelligence. Sure. I use that to forge close relationships with coworkers, with just people in the neighborhood, because if I throw out a reference and they pick it up, from some ridiculous Ace Ventura movie, and we both get what that reference means, we are almost instantly connected.
Yes.
And we almost develop a language of movie phrases and idioms. So maybe I guess what I'm saying is maybe I don't have a completely useless intelligence.
Well, I would certainly agree that so many of your intelligences are very, very useful. And, I think it's been fun in our discussions that, we all often feel like, well, why is this podcast working? We're into our 4th year of the podcast, 4 years with wonderful feedback, wonderful ratings, numbers that we should be very proud of in terms of we're past 1.5 million downloads. And to reflect on why that's the case brings us right back to the fact that you, Dave Finch, have a very different brain than I have. But it seems like almost seamlessly we understand how what you're good at and what I'm good at and what you're not so good at and what I'm not so good at actually complements each other, and that there are lessons to be learned that we can talk about and share with our listeners.
Yep. Everybody's got a unique style, and do those styles harmonize? Like every note in a symphony is a different note from the other one. Do they harmonize well? Do they carry a melody and have the other support the melody? And in our working day to day on this, and I shouldn't even say work, because doing this show with you feels more like play than anything I do in my adult professional life. But it's when you have an idea for a particular couple of topics, and all of your body of work and just the way your brain can map out, here are the really key important points that we would need to address in that. And then I can look at that and say, from a production standpoint, what would be really cool is if we brought in this voice, or we had this kind of, segment or something. And so we see the same we're talking about the same potential conversation with a guest, or we're talking about the same subject matter that we want to address in the podcast. We're coming at it from two complementary different ways. And I think part of it is that you are patient with my ideas, and that works out well because I force you to be patient with my ideas. It's a two-way system.
And when some of your ideas kind of go down this rabbit hole, I'm sitting here emotionally regulating.
See, I benefit from that, and so do you.
But then again, some of the paths that you decide to follow, that your brain is taking you to, are amazingly insightful, and in some cases, amazingly funny. Whereas I tend to be not so funny, or I have about 2 people in my life who get my sense of humor. And I save my jokes for when I'm with them, because everybody else looks at me like, that's not funny.
See, that's just it. Like, that is a big part of the show is I will take risks with what I find funny and floating it out there as a concept that you have learned, and maybe it's just your own instincts, best not to take that risk right now. It's not appropriate. And so, we really, I think, play well together in that way, where I can say, I'm looking at something and that's funny to me. And I think I can say it in a safe enough way that it should be funny enough to the audience as well. And these are like just 2 or 3 examples of so many different ways that, again, complementary styles of thinking and complementary creativities. Hey, we want to talk about this topic. How would we do that? You would address it one way, very systematically. I would address it more touchy-feely, more emotionally or something. And it comes together. And I think we're unique maybe in the sense that we have this podcast that has grown and been very successful, and wonderful to see that, and wonderful that it's helping people. But I also think it's not particularly, I know that it's not unique for different cognitive styles, different cognitive cultures to come together and be able to work in harmony.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So the non-funny Barry is going to step in now for a moment and just reflect for a moment about kind of the history of understanding learning styles, and especially autistic people and many neurodivergent people. And many of our listeners who are practitioners will recognize this, that historically, it was thought that specifically in terms of learning style categories, that autistic people were much better at visual learning, at processing and retaining visual information, and having a learning style based upon what's called rote or episodic memory. And of course, it was Temple Grandin who published the book Thinking in Pictures. So everybody jumped on that, and that was very, very helpful. And I remember it was a revelation in the 80s and early 90s. We need visual supports. We need picture schedules. We need everything laid out visually, which helps everybody, by the way. But now we know that there are many different learning styles in people on the autism spectrum as well. But it seems that those tendencies tend to be more focused and more intense. And in some cases, even extreme, like when we think about people with savant abilities.
Yep. And just clarifying for audience members who are maybe newer to autism and some of these related topics and concepts, what you're saying is, yes, we, again, shared human experience. We share the same learning styles that anybody else would. And in fact, it sometimes might be our nervous system that is making it look like we're not accessing the information because of the way that our physical bodies are regulating against what the nervous system is experiencing or trying to, regulate from itself. So, we can't dismiss the fact that there are multiple fluid learning styles. The way I learn one thing is not the same way that I learn something else. I want to point that out too. It's not like I need, I remember Kristen, my wife, making countless laminated social stories, laminated cards, cutting them up with the laminator. And it was all very visual, like you said. That works great for me in some things and is just not what I need in other situations.
Mm-hmm. And we're not just talking about learning styles in the sense of cognition. We're also talking about how we all have different styles in socializing. So it was thought for years that autistic people weren't interested in socializing. And now we know that's not the case. And in fact, some children, some autistic adults kind of go overboard. They love to connect with people. I think of a young man I knew, actually many young men and some students. We would go into the supermarket and they would introduce themselves to everybody. It was kind of like the little politician,
Absolutely.
And the social motivation to connect was really there, whereas stereotypically in history, we thought that it wasn't. Okay, so even then, we could see the discrepancy within that category, which is incredibly diverse in and of itself, that we call autism.
Right. And, when we were talking to Devin Price recently, he made such a fantastic observation that never even occurred to me, that as a natural consequence of how my brain works, when I am being social with folks and I'm enjoying it, I might not even be aware that I'm being manipulated in that moment, that I wouldn't have, with my own agency, chosen that person to be a friend, but they're sort of foisting friendship on me. And I'm just like, okay, I guess, sort of like in my case, it almost feels like you put a collar on a dog and a leash and that's okay. We're going for a walk now. And it just goes along with it. Like, in my case, that's what it feels like sometimes. So, just the style of how we even navigate through relationships, let alone isolated social settings, can be very different.
Absolutely. For sure. So why don't we talk a little bit about what we've reflected on specific to us? And maybe you could share a little bit your own self-reflections about what your style is. And then we could kind of look at, what we each consider our strengths are and what we each consider what our weaknesses are or needs for support. And then bring it together as to how that really makes the podcast work.
Yeah, I love that question because there's so much to explore within it. I think if you start from, for lack of a better phrase, I'm sure there's a far more professional way to say this, but my brain style is my neurotype or whatever you want to call it. I would much rather go a mile deep into a subject matter, go a mile deep into a relationship with somebody, go a mile deep into one category of food that I like to consume and eat, than have a lot of variation. I'd rather go a mile deep than a mile wide and totally shallow. Mm-hmm. It's funny, even my body is like that. I have like this stretched out Gumby body. It's a mile vertical and not very wide. So the reason I start there, I think in responding to you is that if we're going to pick this apart in any different dimension, let's pick learning styles first. I want to learn about the thing that I'm interested, but I want to learn it all the way down to the atomic level. Mm-hmm. I don't want the general high level grasp of something. In most cases is not interesting to me. I understand now that I'm an adult, I'm 47 years old. I'm starting to understand that sometimes I don't have to learn everything down to the atomic level for me to be able to make use of the information. Mm-hmm. It's almost like my brain is a pointillist painting where I'm paying attention to the actual dots. Mm-hmm. But I can also step back and see the big picture. I think there are some people who stand really close to the pointillist painting and they only see the dots, and that's fine too. And then there are the people who never get close enough to understand that it's made up of dots, right? So, but in getting myself to learn all the way down to the atomic level, we'll stay on the learning example for just a second. I do know this about myself, that it's not a one-size-fits-all learning style. So sometimes I'll need to see it visually. Sometimes I need to read it, reflect, read it again. A lot of times I need to either read it or listen to it or watch it and take notes. And then the words that I've just written down that came out of my hand, I link back to what it is I just either read or watched. I'm like, that makes sense now. Sometimes I need to sketch it myself, or sometimes I need to turn around and just say it out loud to nobody in the room, just for myself, and walk myself through it. Say like, okay, the avalanche mode of this family of MOSFETs is, a lot more temperature dependent because of the blah, 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 the features. And then I get into semiconductor physics and I'm saying it to nobody, but it's making sense. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Again, I'm so far from being a qualified person to speak in clinical terms on any of this or academic or anything. But I would say, like, as an engineer, I would call that multimodal learning. Mm-hmm. And the way my brain works, the way my central processing unit works is I have to be gathering feedback. Am I really getting to the heart of the subject matter by watching this video? No, I still have a million questions. Mm-hmm. So, and yet all the information I need to know should be contained in this video. Mm-hmm. So let me go back. Let me read a transcript of the video. Let me go back. Let me write down the 5 bullet points that I should take away from this video. And then it clicks. But until then, it's just sound. I might as well be listening to music or dolphins chattering or whatever. So I think the other ways I think that might translate then and just into my living experience would be like socially. I want a couple of people like yourself and a handful of close childhood friends where I'm good there and I'll go deep with them.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of, I want 600 superficial friendships because I want that variation. And there are some people who really, love that. But as soon as you start to talk to them about like, tell me about what it's like when trying to go to sleep, you can't get to sleep. What's your brain doing? And they're like, I don't want to talk about anything personal. I just want to have 600 superficial friendships, which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that is, I don't know if there's any link there, but there's certainly, I've noticed a theme that repeats when how my brain works, how it gets me through life is always deep and atomic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting contrast, because I'm kind of a big picture guy, and I like to kind of get a sense of the general gist of things. And it's interesting because people sometimes after they hear me present, they said, oh my God, you know all the research, you know all the details. But very often I cherry pick about what might be some details in some research or something that I heard somebody say during a presentation, only in reference to how much it validates and supports my big picture.
The theme.
Yeah.
Yeah, you are. If you and I were a paragraph, you would be the top sentence, the thesis sentence, and I would be all the supporting details that nobody really needs to read.
That's right. Yeah. As we often say commonly now, you would be into the weeds.
Into the weeds. I'm the minutia guy. But yeah, you're right, because when we talk about this every week, we meet on Mondays and we talk about what we're going to be doing for the next several weeks. And every Monday you're starting with, okay, I saw this person present in Atlanta and the topic is this. And as you're talking, like, here are the big real world implications of what this change to policy means.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sitting there thinking like, what are the best restaurants in Washington, D.C. for the lobbyists to take those legislators out to get and eventually we get there and it's like, there's our episode. That's how we're going to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we actually did put some time into developing a little bit of a chart. And full transparency here, this is actually an exercise that we did for an article that we were interviewed for that was published in Autism Parenting Magazine, just 2 or 3 months ago. And we kind of viewed it, and I don't know if this is accurate, but I kind of gave it the labels of, Barry's strengths and Dave's strengths, and then Dave's limitations, and then Barry's limitations. And I think it'll reinforce some of what we've been talking about here.
Yeah.
So and you just kind of almost gave a description of this, that if I hear speakers, if I read something online and I feel like, okay, we have this landscape in our podcast, and the landscape is designed with numbers of different potential themes, but we want to make sure we're speaking to parents of young kids. We want to make sure we're speaking to autistic self-advocates, that we're speaking to even researchers and academicians and clinical scholars. And so a little bit of my role is out there kind of surveying the landscape through, I've been around a few years, so I have a lot of people that I've met over the years, and kind of going for those social connections in the autism landscape and say, oh, that would really be a good guest, or that person wants to be on the podcast, but what she wants to talk about has nothing to do with neurodiversity or autism.
Right.
Sorry, thank you for sending your interest, but no. As happens a lot these days with agents.
Does, yes.
But you bring a very different type of insight. And what is that?
I would say I bring, and it's in the table actually, I would say I bring the lived experience, which is just some of the nuancy stuff that every time I've noticed validates what it is you're talking about. And I'm not saying I'm validating what you're saying. What I'm saying is that it's funny what you bring to the table actually validates where I'm like, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've lived those words in my marriage over the last however many years. And it's interesting that the lived experience ends up matching with, and I do love that you bring the social piece to this also, and the big picture of the autism landscape, because otherwise, you know me, I would get totally hung up on like, oh, we got to talk about AAC for the next 6 months, but because I'm going deep on it. But your social connections things, like if you and I speak at the same conference, you are making those connections and almost curating constellations of coworkers and collaborators. And when I'm at that same conference, I go up, I give my presentation, and I think, how quickly can I get back to the hotel because there's a South Park marathon on? That's all I'm cared about. All I'm worrying about is my own comfort in any situation. And you're looking at kind of big picture stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, also kind of related to your ability to pull from your own experiences and tell, very, very detailed stories from your childhood or, your relationship with Kristen. I kind of bring, okay, well, what's the history of autism? As I just did in speaking about traditionally how have learning styles been thought of in the history of autism. But you bring another aspect based upon your learned experience, which of course, not only do you have a lot of expertise in, but your book, The Journal of Best Practices, focuses on that.
Yeah, exactly. It's the knowledge of how autism works in the superset and in the specific case you've got down pat. And I can bring to the table, like you said, an example from my own marriage and my whole book, 250 pages about about that specific thing. And it's funny when we talk to guests, they just really enjoy both perspectives. Mm-hmm. You'll write these amazing questions, these interview questions, and we go through them, and it's great. And then I'll chime in with something from my past, like you said, and the guest can immediately jump on that too and say, yes, you're exactly right. We've noticed X, Y, Z. And I think another thing that, if we want to look into the technical aspects of what we both do vocationally, as we both know, I am not an autism researcher. I'm a Dave researcher, and I only do that so I can learn how to make my life even more comfortable than it already is.
Yes.
But you will go both deep and wide when it comes to research. Without
getting too caught up in some of the peripheral details. So again, people will say to me, because I was trained academically, people would say to me, oh my God, you're so familiar with so many aspects of the research in autism, but, is that a contradiction with what I said earlier, that I'm a big picture guy? I go for the gist of what's important and relevant, especially in application. So yes, of course, research is important, and research is important to me. But if you look at the types of research that I've done, going back to my dissertation, it was qualitative research. It was looking at the bigger picture. It was not highly analytic, kind of empirical research, setting up control groups and, really trying to compare groups on all these details. Yeah, we published a few studies like that. But it's mostly, let's understand this person as a whole human being. Let's understand how they communicate, how they regulate, and not so much in the great detail. But you do have technical knowledge that's so important for this podcast. And, for that, I was going to say either you could say novice or let's go down a few steps. I'm a clown when it comes to issues in audio engineering and the technical aspects.
Not at all. You just have bigger fish to fry. You've got more important things. I don't have bigger fish to fry. I am an audio nerd. And so when you reached out to me 4 years ago, I'm thinking about doing a podcast. I think one of the very first things I probably said in that meeting, the first phone call, was, well, it's an audio format. And so sure, there will be examples where somebody's on Zoom or the microphone didn't work, so you talked into the computer, and it's not always going to sound perfect. But if we shoot for 80% of the time, the engineering and production value of our show is excellent. That really honors the listener, because all we have is their ears. We're not a video podcast. We're not a book. We are with them in their headphones and on their speakers. And so it's got to sound great. And to get us there, I know exactly how to do it. So I set you up acoustically in your basement, and set you up with, we'll use this microphone or that audio interface, because I know how, on a shoestring budget, how to get the acoustical environment set up so that it sounds like we're in a studio, and you don't have to pay the studio prices. And in fact, you can see, if this ends up becoming like a little clip on social media, you can see my wife was very patient with me in converting our master bedroom closet into a voice studio that is, I would put this up against any, $500 an hour room in New York that, from studios. And it's a closet. So, I went so far as I calculated the different, where the different room modes would be acoustically in this little voice room, and tuned this room specifically to my voice. It's not just I threw up some padding. So I know that my voice is consistent wherever I sit in the room. And Kristen was like, it's good enough if you just hang some blankets. I'm like, oh, no, it's not.
Good enough for me, though.
All right, before we continue talking about our amazing different brains, let's take a break for 1 second. We'll be right back.
Okay.
And by the way, notice the flow of this very conversation is you are providing high-level contextual responses, and you're saying them efficiently in about 30 seconds. If you look at the audio waveforms for this interview, I'm probably doing 98% of the talking, and I'm talking in completely unnecessary details. This could have been a 2-minute episode.
Right. Which actually is one of the roles that I play due to my style. And I don't know why this is the case. I didn't exactly grow up in a highly organized home, but it's the scheduling and the reminders, and giving you these looks on Zoom like, okay, Dave, we have to kind of start wrapping up.
The guest only gave us 1 hour of their time.
And you always have the humor that people love to listen to, that I love to listen to. Actually, your humor has allowed me to try to be more humorous.
See, and I have, in my day job in the corporate world, I have taken your executive function insistence and actually applied it in my day job. I want an agenda for every phone call I'm going to be on. I do that now. I was never an agenda person. It was like, well, I'll find out what this meeting is about in the meeting, I guess. But now I'm one of the only people in my organization at work who says, we will use this time to achieve the following. 6 bullets, done. And that came from you, actually. So I'm becoming a real boy. Actually, you know what's interesting too about
you're welcome.
Like Pinocchio, Geppetto. You grew up in like you said, a home that wasn't hyper structured or anything, and yet you've got this tremendous executive functioning. I grew up in a home that ran precision like clockwork, like a military operation. Dinner at 6. Mom is cooking dinner at 4:30 to make sure dinner's ready at 6. All the stuff. And that stuff was just a given in my life. It was so permanent. Mm-hmm. I didn't have to think ever about my day. And meanwhile, my parents, I loved making them laugh. I loved the sound of them laughing. So as long as I was making them laugh, I figured I was doing right in life. And here we are. You had to learn, like, if I want something to happen, I got to make it happen.
Yeah.
And I'm like, everything's funny, so make fun of it.
Yeah. And now we're talking about, or at least alluding to, the role of influences in our lives. So you're talking about externally imposed structure and scheduling. Okay. Mm-hmm. I grew up, and I think I've shared this before, I lost my mother tragically when I was 12 years of age. My father never remarried, and he basically said, and he was a wonderful dad, and he basically said, okay, I'm not going to get married just to bring a lady into the house to raise you kids. I have one sister. So we're going to have to take care of each other, but take care of ourselves. So I had to generate the structures in my life. I didn't have people pointing to me saying, you need to do this at this time, or you need to clean up your room, or you need to do this.
Yeah.
So I had a messy room, but
all right.
I needed to organize some predictability and certainty in my life. Yep.
But you are also self-reliant. You trust your instincts. Part of the reason I clown around all the time is because I don't trust myself to do anything right. And I didn't have to, because mom and dad took care of and I had an older brother, and the stuff that slipped through the cracks with dad or with mom, my older brother John had to. So I was just free to fly around like a kite, being a cartoon character.
Dave, I didn't really expect that this would evolve into a therapy session for both of us.
Send me an invoice, I'll pay it. Do you take Aetna insurance?
So, just one other aspect of what we were talking about with executive function is I'm very conscious and aware of making sure that, there are guardrails on the topics that we talk about in terms of the management piece. And as I alluded to earlier, in some cases to great benefit, in other cases to longer podcasts than we would have thought would happen. You sometimes will go down rabbit holes, but those rabbit holes end up in interjecting interesting and relevant tangents. At first I'm thinking, why are we going here? And then I find out why we're going there with Dave.
That's because sometimes my brain catches up to itself and is like, you better start making a point here, Cheech. No, topic management is a big thing. So again, I know that you've got the structure because just so our listeners know, every guest we have on there, and even when we have these conversations with ourselves, Barry puts in the we'll call them the channel markers. If you're driving a boat through a passageway, you need channel markers to know where your boat should stay, and so you don't hit anything. And because that's so solid and concrete, again, it's almost like I'm free to just sit there and almost like a bee trying to land on a flower. Like I'm free to just buzz around the topic and then bang, jump in on something. If you notice, like the really good questions about the subject matter are coming from Barry. The questions that get deeply personal are usually coming from me. Not always, but that's why we complement each other. Because if you had a podcast with me, and I've proven this with my own attempts at a solo podcast, unlistenable. You can't listen to somebody crack jokes for an hour unless they're a comedian, which I'm not. So we need that sort of. And by the way, that makes this. It always, to me, the conversation always feels very organic, because you and I are both talking about the same thing, but we're talking about it from different, motivations, I'll say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, playing my role as timekeeper and manager, let's acknowledge to our listeners, this isn't really just about Dave and Barry. We're discussing these issues because it's relevant for understanding, respecting, and supporting people who have different learning styles, different social styles, different emotional regulatory styles. So why don't we begin to just talk a little bit about not only advice for parents, but advice for partners who are neurotypical, who have neurodivergent friends, family members. What are some of the important takeaways here? So let me start with one, and then Dave, take us into a rabbit hole with this. And of course, the most obvious point, which I could just, address quickly, is let's understand that different learning styles do not require pathologizing one versus the other. It's about really understanding that every person has strengths. Every person has different ways of processing information, of different ways of interacting with others. But let's learn what those ways are and be respectful, and then provide the necessary accommodations to make things work in your relationship with that person and in that person's life.
Yeah, I mean, it's as ubiquitous as weather, right? Like, if you can't do anything about rain, what are you going to sit there and say, oh, rain makes my daily life so hard, so I'm just going to live my life in such a way I never experience rain. Rain being a diversity of thought or something like that. Or you can learn, well, let's problem solve here. What are some ways to use the rain to our benefit? What are some ways to get out of the rain when we need to, when we don't feel like being wet? And I think what it comes down to for you and me is mutual respect. I think it's funny to, or sometimes tempting to make the assumption that, okay, if we're talking neurotypical, neurodivergent, what I'm saying is there's a right way to be human, and that ain't it, right? Mm-hmm. And because we're in the majority neurotypicals, what you're doing is so weird, we need you to change for us, right? Or play on our terms, make life easier for us. And a smaller percentage of the population turns around and says, no, we're not the weird ones here. But there's a mutual respect where you are just letting me be myself as we navigate through, whether it's, hey, this person wants to sponsor our podcast, let's have a conversation with them. We both come uniquely to the table. I'm not pretending to be some alternate version of Barry. You're not pretending to be some different version of Dave, or just talking with a guest. So that is something that I see in the workplace a lot, where a manager says, here's how we are going to do things in this group, and everybody get on board. And the people who won't cotton to that, maybe won't adopt that way of doing it, are almost vilified. And it's like, well, the really good managers look at the person who's not adopting that approach and saying, like, why? What is it about what I'm asking them to do that isn't working for them? Not why aren't they doing what I want? And but doesn't that also apply to marriages and to family situations?
And for things to work successfully, I'm surprised this word has not come up in this episode, as it's come up many times before, interdependence. So if a person is not on board in your example for some reason, could it be they need somebody who is on board to kind of help them to be on board, or at least meet them halfway to help them move in that direction? So an example just came to mind, when I first approached you about doing the podcast, and this is absolute truth, I had never listened to a podcast before in my life.
Yep.
And here I am. Okay, I'm going to do a podcast. And you had a lot of experience, both yourself, both with your wife, Kristen, as well as with engineering companies, helping them to produce and put out podcasts. So there's the yin yang fitting right there, but I don't have the lived experience of being a neurodivergent person, and you do. And yin yang comes together right there.
Right. And if you had two Daves, God forbid, trying to make a podcast, we wouldn't get anything done, because there would be no agendas in the meetings. We would go down every rabbit hole except for the big picture, and we would lose sight of the forest because we were fixated on the trees, and the podcast would never launch. So I think the way that I would, connect those dots for parents who are out there, because as you and I are both parents ourselves, is, you don't always have to be that angel that swoops in and is the window to the world for your kiddo. That you will find, if you really look, there will be people just in your life who can be that guardian angel, so to speak, the window to the world. I've got a few in my own life that have gotten me through, Cliff at work and Kristen and the rest of non-work life have really been sort of that angel that you're describing, where it's like, hey, the world expects this, not just of you personally, but of everybody. Nobody's unique in this. The world expects you to show up in this way. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to. Here are the consequences if you don't. But here are some ways that you can show up in a way that's a little more in line with what the world expects an adult to behave like.
Mm-hmm.
And then I can work towards that instead of just, I'm different. You got to accept me the way I am. Like, that's not going to serve people. I mean, the essence, the purest form of self-advocacy would be that. But I think even the staunchest self-advocates will tell you that you still have to operate in the world.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to be able to get things done.
And to benefit from what those angels have to offer, you have to be able to trust them. And they have to be able to develop a trustworthy relationship with you. Again, a theme that has resonated throughout the years in this podcast. Without that sense of this person might be gently steering me in another direction from the direction I'm taking on my own, you have to say, okay, this person's intentions are only for my good. And if I kind of slip off the road, they will be the safety net and help me get back up and continue to move forward. And we all need that in our lives. There's no doubt about it.
Yep. That is not a autism thing. That's a human being thing.
Absolutely. Well, so much of what we're talking about is a human being thing.
Exactly. So that's what I wish people would understand. This podcast is not about autism.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of my dear friends going back to my college days, who is an avid listener of the podcast, who knows very little about autism, listens because she says she takes away things to improve her own quality of life from every episode, listening to both neurotypical and neurodivergent people sharing their lives and what they've learned.
Yep. And I listen to our show too. I don't listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to Bill Burr comedy podcast and ours and Kristen's because I learned things from her. And I listen to it because, there's a trust, there's a mutual respect that I enjoy hearing, even though I was a part of it. I like listening back to it. So,
yeah. So we hope that our listeners also come away with something from this discussion and be a little bit, everybody is self-reflective to some extent, but maybe even being that much more reflective and that much more understanding of neurodivergent people in general, because we're talking about so much misunderstanding about neurodivergent people, but also our partners, our children, people we share our lives with.
Absolutely. Every family is neurodiverse. Every kitchen table conversation has is marked by neurodiversity. Every classroom is neurodiverse. Every doctor's office is neurodiverse. Why? Because human beings are not a homogeneous creature.
Yes. Yeah.
We're varied, and you can work against that, or you can use it to your advantage. Yeah. Bottom line.
So let us know what you think about this discussion, whether it's, Barry and Dave just rambling down these rabbit holes, or if it resonated with you and what resonated with you. We love to hear about that.
Please do. And do it in Patreon, do it on our social media, just email us, whatever. But we love hearing the feedback, and we love doing the show. So Barry, this was great. I am going to go and have zero structure to the rest of my day. You're going to go because you've got a very tightly mapped out structure for the rest of your day.
Oh, I thought you were going to go microanalyze all the auditory qualities of this podcast and my voice.
Actually, no, because this was a social interaction that was important to me. I'm actually going to, when we hang out, I'm going to go through and go through all my responses and see how I could have done them better, and then somehow not apply that wisdom next time. That's how I work.
Okay, Dave, to be continued.
All right. Thanks, Barry.
Have a good evening.